The end of the 1960s marked a period of uncertainty in the United States after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and of Robert Kennedy in 1968. Riots in the inner cities, protests against the Vietnam War, and resistance to the implementation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Women's rights had long been a feature of political discussion, with the suffrage movement that resulted in the passage in 1920 of the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to vote. That decade also saw the foundation of the League of Women Voters, and by the 1960s, the League had more members than at any other time and protested for the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which made wage equality based on sex a part of federal law. Then, in 1972, President Richard Nixon signed the Education Amendments Act into law. This act included Title IX, a section of law which requires that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. As written, Title IX seemed like a huge triumph for the progress of women's rights because it prohibited unequal treatment. But the application of Title IX has also been tragic because it was resisted strongly and women were still not treated as equals, especially in university athletics.
Women have faced discrimination in athletics for a very long time. In ancient Greece, women were not allowed to participate in or watch men's Olympics. Women did have their own games called the Heria every 4 years, but they were only allowed to compete in short foot races and had to wear short tunics with exposed shoulders and hair down. The first modern Olympics in 1896 only included male athletes, and women's sports were not officially recognized until the 1908 London Olympics. For women who enjoyed athletics but were banned from participation in sports, the fact that they weren't allowed to participate was tragic for their interest in competition or a career in athletics. But since the first decades of the 20th century, and especially after women were allowed to vote in the 1920s, women's sports history has been more triumphant than tragic. The founding, in 1943, of the first All-American Girls Baseball League, Kathy Switzer's 1967 participation in the men's-only Boston Marathon, the 1968 lighting of the Olympic torch in the Mexico City Games by Enriqueta Basilio, and in 1973, the infamous Battle of the Sexes, a tennis match between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs, which Billie Jean King won.
It was at this time in the late 1960s and early 1970s when women were first admitted to major universities including Princeton, Yale, and Johns Hopkins, and women's athletics started to compete for national attention. At the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, women were first admitted in 1972, but this men's sports powerhouse, famous for its football and basketball programs, would soon face growing pains in the face of this transition. Initially, only 125 women were admitted in that first co-ed class, and the ratio was 20 men for every woman. And by the end of the decade, the ratio was still 3 men to every woman. Even so, from 1973 to 1977, over 200 women competed in intercollegiate athletics.
Then, in the summer of 1976, the news filtered out that Notre Dame would finally have varsity teams. Although this was a huge step forward for women's athletics at Notre Dame, the tragically unequal treatment of women's varsity teams when compared to the men's is illustrated by the conditions in which the university's women's basketball team played in the 1970s.
We shared a locker room with every other varsity women's team at Notre Dame. So while the men had separate locker rooms, all of the women were in one locker room because we didn't have that many programs and we had just one large varsity locker room. Our uniforms are particularly, scary looking. We wear the same uniform year after year after year, whereas a lot of times the men would get a new uniform every year, every other year. So, as far as the support that we had, if those same elements were in place today, it would be a clear-cut violation of Title IX.
At the time that Missy Convoy played, the women's teams could only practice after the men's team was done. The women were limited to games against local universities, while the men played across the nation. The women's team was only occasionally broadcast on local television, while the men were often featured in national broadcasts. And the traveling conditions represented the biggest difference. The women traveled in vans with members bringing flashlights to work on homework. while the men often traveled by buses or planes. As a result, the women's team would play to nearly empty courts well into the 1990s. In those early years of the 1970s, women's athletics as a whole at Notre Dame struggled with shoestring budgets, getting only 19% of the overall athletics budget, but things were about to change.
It was on June 23, 1972, that President Richard Nixon signed the Education Amendments Act, which included Title IX, into law. Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana was an avid supporter of women's rights. He co-sponsored the bill and wrote Title IX. Initially, Title IX was focused on equality in education, but it would eventually have a huge impact on women's athletics, reversing years of tragic inequality because of its anti-discrimination mandate. As part of the law states, no one, male or female, shall be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. One way for colleges to comply with this component of the law was to meet the proportionality requirement. This required that each college have men's and women's varsity-level sports in relation to the number of students enrolled in the college. But even this was only a partial triumph, because on May 20, 1974, Senator John Tower of Texas proposed an amendment to the law that, if passed, would have exempted revenue-producing sports from Title IX. Fortunately, the Tower Amendment was rejected the same day, thanks in part to Senator Birch Bayh's opposition. According to a New York Times article published in 1979, Notre Dame head hockey coach Charles Smith thought that this could have a far-reaching effect. "We don't want to drop any men's sports just to give scholarships to women athletes, but we may be forced to do it." But Lynn Kaczmarek, former athletic director at St. Mary's College, Indiana, thinks that is not the point at all.
Title IX was never put in place to hurt or take away opportunities for boys or men. It was put in place to elevate opportunities for girls. But the sad thing is it has hurt some guys' teams. And even though they've taken away some opportunities for boys and for men, women still have not caught up.
And although Title IX's implementation may have hurt some so-called minor men's sports, author Susan Kahn wrote that this is not a result of Title IX demanding that they be cut. It is a result of athletic departments deciding to leave football untouched. Even so, at Notre Dame, where football and basketball would have been exempted under the Tower Amendment, the university now has a total of 26 varsity sports, 13 for men and 13 for women. This would not have been possible if the Tower Amendment had been introduced as a part of Title IX.
Though women's athletics have come a long way since 776 BC, there is still a long way to go. It is true that potential hurdles to women's athletic success, such as the Tower Amendment, have not been successful, and Notre Dame serves as a case study that reflects women's athletic success at universities compared to men. 11 of the last 12 NCAA championships at Notre Dame have been earned by women, including in 2018 when Notre Dame's women's basketball team won the championship thanks to a last-second three-pointer, earning their triumphant place in Notre Dame sports history. However, professional women athletes get paid less than their male counterparts, even if their sport generates more revenue. For example, in 2016, the women's national soccer team, which had more income than the men's soccer team, filed a complaint against U.S. Soccer for being paid 1/4 of what the men were paid. And even though women's Olympic events get as much, if not more attention than men's, women Olympians do not receive as many sponsorships or endorsements. So the tragedy is that we still have not seen university athletic success for women transfer to the professional sphere. Title IX opened the door for women's athletics at the university level, but until there is broad support from business sponsors and more local and national media coverage for female athletes and women's sports, competitive success will not equal financial success.